exit planning strategies. The Dan Rossi Show.
Now today, we're talking about a subject that comes up continuously in the process of the business owner preparing to sell their business. When there's children involved, and so many times there are, whether they're active, participating in the running of the company, or whether they're inactive, we have some challenges that are going to be discussed today. Now, one of those challenges is, and it has to do with the parents as they think about the distribution of the assets and how to do that equally to all the children. Now, the thought of giving one asset, and very likely the most valuable asset, to one child is considered unequal and therefore unfair. Well, what do you do in that situation? Well, upon closer examination, we can see that leaving the business entirely to the business active child and making an equitable distribution of the balance of family assets to the inactive children is the fairest plan of all. Fairness, however, in this context is usually a judgment that parents make about what they think is fair to the children. What it overlooks is what the children deem to be fair to each one of them. How often do you see these disagreements where what is acceptable for one child is not acceptable to another? And then, to make matters even more challenging, after a time goes on where the work is put into the structuring of the agreements and more reality begins to take place in the minds of the children, they begin to see it differently. One may begin to see that, no, this isn't what I had in mind for my best interest. So a lot of pre-planning and a lot of discussion needs to take place before the process starts. So let's look at why the business active child might well resent having a co-owner, particularly a sibling, who is inactive in the business. Number one, it's the efforts of the business active child to increase the value of the business that should be rewarded. Why? Well, as we know, if that child is directly responsible for increasing revenue and is a well-structured operations type person, we can anticipate profits are going to rise along with increases in sales and revenue. So as an entrepreneurial chip off the old block, your child doesn't want to share ownership any more than you did. So the controlling vote is not enough to create a balanced situation. Something else has to be considered. So, where are we going with this? Well, when there are co-owners, the child running the business has a fiduciary duty, or increasing his or her own salary, or indulging in other business perks, as you probably do, must all be reasonable and comparable to what a non-shareholder performing child would do for the company. So, I doubt you'd want to subject your compensation and perks to the same level of scrutiny. And what about the inactive child's perspective? Inactive children are unlikely to want to have ownership in the business, and if other choices are available, they'll probably take those. So, as we look at this and we sort of zoom in closer, we see that inactive children generally prefer to own or receive assets that are more liquid and less risk-oriented than having direct ownership in the business. And this is usually true even if they have to wait until both parents die to receive their inheritance. Now, if the inactive child owns part of the business today, have they received anything of real value yet? Partial business ownership will make the inactive child the proud owner of a illiquid security that generates no immediate income or other benefits. Even further, if we look closer, the inactive child has no ability to sell his interest except to the business active child. Yet, that's hardly a problem since the active child won't, in all likelihood, have the money to purchase it. So, if he does, then the business active child's idea for a fair market value is likely to differ dramatically from what that is of the inactive child. And here you've created your own Cain and Abel situation. So it would seem that from the above point that the inactive ownership interest would have little value. And now friendlier IRS begs to disagree. While the non-controlling ownership interest can certainly be discounted in value, it'll nevertheless rise in value as the overall business value increases due to the efforts of the business active child. So, because it's a difficult situation for the inactive child to get rid of the ownership, they're going to deal with the tax consequences. And that's problematic. So, the one last thing to keep in mind here is that the inactive child will not be able to make decisions regarding the future course of the business. Now, if only one child should be in the business, how do you find the second ingredient, fairness to all children? And if there were 4 children, one actively running it and the other 3 inactive, then when transferring the business to the business active child and other assets to the inactive, the obstacles to a fair transfer of assets are rather numerous. For example, the business value may be significantly greater than the combined value of the remaining family assets. Another one is that if part of the business value is attributable to the business active child's efforts, then it's not fair to consider that part of the business to be the child's interest now. So, how do you determine the active child's contribution to existing business value? And this is very pertinent and requires some soft handling, some very in-depth thinking to arrive at that. And let's not forget the timing issue. It makes good business sense as well as income and estate tax sense to transfer a significant amount of the business during your lifetime to the business active child. The inactive children, however, will not likely receive their share of the business during your lifetime. And what happens here is that the inactive children become less financially wealthy than the active. And the reason for this is simple. The non-business assets are usually retained by you to provide income and financial security for yourself, for your spouse. So after your demise, the resulting timing difference is mitigated by the liquidity, the difference in the assets the children receive. So the business active child may receive assets now, but his assets are highly illiquid and subject to business risk. The inactive children may have to wait, but the assets they receive will be highly liquid and relatively risk-free. So you've got some weights there that need to be balanced, not just from your own perspective of what you may think is fair, but again, we go back to what the children believe is fair. And in addition to the present difficulty of this distribution process of the business assets and non-business assets equally, there's an added complexity of measuring the current value of the business interest given to the business active child against the future value of the bequests given to the inactive child. And to understand the present versus future value conundrum, consider some of these facts that I'm going to share with you now. One is that the business active child, adding to the business's value through his or her efforts, if so, he should not have to pay for that effort by receiving a reduced share of the ultimate value. Another one is that the active child, by continuing in the business after your retirement, becomes a critical element in your actual retirement plan. And by ensuring that the business can pay you the deferred compensation and purchase your stock. And if so, the means by which you tier her or him to the business, the golden handcuffs, or I should say, tying them to the business through the golden handcuffs program, may be the transfer of stock. Again, acquiring stock because it benefits you should not penalize the business active child when it comes to sharing in the estate. And then another point is that the business active child paying for part of the business or all of the business is a definite consideration today. So how can one possibly find the correct, measure of these ingredients? How can one possibly balance things so that everybody's happy? Is it possible to even do it in the first place? Well, for most families, that decision ultimately comes down to a discussion of fairness versus equality. And because the difference in contribution to the business and differences between assets being gifted, business versus non-business, and consequent timing difference, it's imperative to be equitable or fair in the treatment of, and as we discussed previously, timing, because timing is going to change the value. So parents must strive to be fair. On one hand, they must communicate and explain this strategy to all the children. And in our example here, we're using one active of a total of 4 children, one active in the company, and the other 3 having nothing to do with the company. So finally, be certain to make appropriate adjustments in your will, in your trust, in your buy-sell agreements to apportion assets if your lifetime transfers of the business and other assets are not completed before you pass on. So as part of these documents, the business active child should have the right to have her share or his share of your estate consist of business interests, while the remaining children have the right to have their portion of the estate satisfied with other interests, with personal assets outside of the business.